Hello and welcome to Exhistoria Scientia Cinematheque and our commentary track today for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, Chapter 2, called Passion for Life. My name is Jason Mount.
And I'm Anthony Stauder.
And today we'll be providing you with a commentary track, giving you some background on historical figures and events that occur in this episode and how they tie in, both in accuracy and in terms of chronology, because that'll be a bit of an issue in this episode, to reality. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to queue up your own copy of the episode, whether you are streaming it or watching it on a DVD or whatever it may be. And you're going to queue it up to the Paramount logo with the mountain. And when we give you the signal, you'll press record. So you'll press play. And then you'll be watching it along in synchronization with us. So at this moment, queue up your DVD. And Anthony, you're all queued up on your end?
I am.
As am I. All right, if everybody's all ready to go, then press play now. You should be seeing the Paramount logo with the stars over the top of the mountain. This episode is British. It's actually two episodes that aired separately. One in March of 1992, the other in June of 1993. The episodes were British East Africa, September 1909, and Paris, September 1908. They are here shown out of chronological order as they were originally filmed. For whatever reason, when they reorganized these into the 2-hour movies, George Lucas chose to put the African section first. I think this is because he wanted to maintain the original pilot, which was, of course, set in Egypt. And the show itself didn't show the episodes in chronology, so that wasn't an issue. So this part is the British East Africa, which was set in September of 1909. Because, of course, that's when the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition we're going to see took place. Began in 1909, finished in 1910. The second half of the episode is Paris, September 1908. I'm not sure if they consider this part, you can't really change the part of the expedition, so it has to be 1909, which means the Paris section has to be occurring in 1909 as well. Although originally it was meant to be occurring in 1908. Either way, I'll probably have something to point out about inaccuracies about either time zone. This is the first episode to feature an alumnus of... I'm sorry, it's the second episode to feature an alumnus of Raiders of the Lost Ark, because Paul Freeman is in this episode. He was, of course, Rene Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he'll appear here as Frederick Selous. Now, the character we're going to meet here is Richard Medlicott, and it's a fictional character. There's a scene that was written, but I don't know if they filmed it. I know they did not include it, but they did have originally written a scene between him and Henry Jones Sr. And if you may recall that scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade when Henry Jones Sr. and Marcus Brody, they meet in the tank, and they do that little saying, "Genius of the Restoration, aid our own resuscitation." The characters of Richard Medlicott and Henry Sr. were going to do that little saying. It's kind of a shame they didn't film it. So that's the fictional character of Medlicott, who's Henry Sr.'s old college buddy. Now, this guy is Edmund Heller. Edmund Heller is a real person. He was part of the expedition. In 1907, he led an expedition to Africa for the Field Museum in Chicago. He was he worked for the Field Museum. He was also curator of mammals at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at the University of California. And while he was there in 1908, he was a member of the Alexander, Alaska expedition, which went up and took specimens from Alaska. And then in 1909, of course, he joins the Smithsonian Roosevelt African expedition we're seeing here. He was specifically the naturalist for large mammals. They had another guy named Loring was in charge of small mammals. He co-wrote Roosevelt's Life Histories of African Game Animals. Heller actually did some other expeditions. He had a lot of expeditions to retrieve animals for specimens in museums. 1911, 1912, he was on the Paul Rainey's Rainey African expedition. 1919 to 1920, he was on the Smithsonian Cape to Cairo expedition, which went from the tip of Africa all the way up to the north of Africa. And he was also on another biological survey in Alaska. He went to Peru for Yale University and the National Geographic Society. He went to China for the American Museum of Natural History, and he, of course, went on another expedition with Paul Rainey to Russia.
This expedition was designed to gather plants, animals of all sizes for the Smithsonian, and they ended up collecting around 5,000 specimens for the Smithsonian.
Yeah, it was a pretty big thing. Now I mentioned Loring was in charge of small animals. That guy was actually named John Alden Loring. He gathered a lot of specimens during his time. Now here we have Frederick Selous, played by Paul Freeman, who played Rene Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Frederick Selous is one of the more interesting characters, not just in terms of this episode, but in terms of history. I'll go into him a little bit later here because we just saw Kermit Roosevelt, who is Theodore Roosevelt's, I believe it's his second son. I don't think it's his oldest son. Kermit, in case you're wondering, his middle name, he's named after his mother's middle name. She was named after, her name was Edith Kermit, and her brother's name was Kermit. Their great uncle was Robert Kermit, and that was his last name. And so the family just took to naming his last name as a first name for their children, or a middle name for her. And so Theodore and Edith named Kermit their second oldest son. He was the official photographer for this expedition, and it wasn't his first or his last time he did stuff with his dad, obviously. In 1912, he would go on the Roosevelt Rondon scientific expedition, which went to South America, and they traced the Roosevelt River, which is a tributary of the Amazon. He was an active member of the Boone and Crockett Club, which was founded by his father. And like his father, he embraced the ideals of conservation. He went on another expedition in 1925, the James Simpson Roosevelt Asiatic Expedition for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which included a Himalayan expedition with his brother Theodore Roosevelt III. They wrote a book called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. And if you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, some of the specimens from that expedition are there. There we have Theodore Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt was interested in the big game animals, and he ended up collecting 296 big game specimens for the Smithsonian. His son Kermit collected 216. So in total, that's about 10% of the total uh, collection donated to the Smithsonian from this expedition.
Teddy Roosevelt, of course, people know him as former president. He was former vice president under William McKinley, became president upon McKinley's assassination. But he had an interesting life all the way up prior to that. He was very sick as a child. He had a lot of health problems, asthma basically, and he began exercising to build up his strength and his ability to just do anything because he was so sick all the time. In 1869, he went on hiking vacation in the Alps, and that's when he took to doing a lot of hiking and became fascinated with the outdoors. At age 7, he saw a seal at a market and just became kind of fascinated with the diversity of life out there. He taught himself taxidermy and actually preserved numerous animals and insects and stuff like that.
He did that at age 12, which was quite remarkable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, for 5 years basically after seeing a seal at the market, he became fascinated. He taught himself in 5 years. He became really good at it, which for a young age is pretty impressive. His father helped found the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, which most people don't know that. There's actually a photograph of him in 1865. He was very young, looking out the window of their townhouse in New York City as Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession is going by. And if you look at the picture of New York City's funeral procession for Abraham Lincoln, you look up in the window of one of the buildings behind it, you see two little figures, and one of those is future President Theodore Roosevelt. Conservation for him began to take root with his mind in about 1883 because he visited Dakota territories on a bison hunting trip, and he bought land and built a ranch called Elkhorn Ranch in North Dakota. That was 1884. He had a very idealized idea of what it was to be an outdoorsman and a cowboy. He dressed in buckskins complete with a fringe and a fur cap and a whole Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone type look that would make the 1950s TV shows proud. He didn't impress the actual cowboys because they looked at him like, you're some greenhorn just, coming in here with these romanticized visions of what we do.
Well, he is from the upper crust of New York society. So.
Right. And so they looked at him like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
And the thing is that he actually could handle himself well, and he took to learning. He made mistakes. He tried to learn from them, which is an advantage as a human being, because he gained their respect. And so by the end, they did respect him as legitimate, even though initially he looked like a figure out of a cartoon. He promoted conservation, from there on. He formed the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887, which is America's oldest conservation society.
That was inspired by Grinnell, who had started the Audubon Society and then wanted to do something similar for the large animals in the American West. Grinnell had a profound impact on Roosevelt and his commitment to conservation. In fact, the society had been established by Roosevelt at the urging of Grinnell, and the two of them and another person were founding members. They ended up succeeding in promoting conservation in Yellowstone Park, which took extraordinary efforts to lobby Congress, and they ended up succeeding in getting laws passed to stop hunting and poaching on the land.
Well, not only that, they were actually responsible for the push to end commercial hunting. The
Right.
idea that you go out there and you hunt animals as a product, for the fur trade was very big, as you may
Yeah,
recall, in the
the
19th
skins
century.
were highly prized, even as the large animals were becoming extinct.
Right. So if they put an end to commercial hunting and the introduction of obviously of agricultural
And they
domestication.
defined what it meant to be a sportsman hunter, and through, well, Grinnell especially through the through forests and streams, and then also uh, Roosevelt and Grinnell through the Boone and Crockett Club.
Well, the thing is, they aided in efforts to create the National Park Service and the National Forest Service, and they also helped create the National Wildlife Refuge System, which because they viewed wildlife to be a public trust, be something that belongs to the people. That's one of the principles we have even to this day of conservation is that parks and what's inside the parks are the property of the American people, not just an individual. And it's a public trust that as a resource, it has to be preserved and managed. That's why they fought to eliminate the game markets because obviously, if you're going in there hunting, you're hunting for your own use. You're not hunting for the betterment of the species itself or for the public's benefit. What the Boone and Crockett Club did was that they ensured the use of law extended into public areas. You couldn't just go out there, because it's a wilderness and just take what you want. So they pushed for like the Endangered Species Act. They pushed for the Marine Mammal Protection Act because both of those ensured that just because you're there and nobody else is around doesn't mean you can kill anything you want. They opposed casual killing, so they were very much in favor of conservation killing. Thinning the herd for the benefit of the herd, not just shooting just for the heck of it. Because people used to go out and hunt bison, and they would just shoot them, as many as they could. They didn't only take it to an American perspective. They also looked at it as an international resource. That these specimens that are indigenous to the United States are not just property of the American people, but they are the resource and asset of the entirety of humanity. It's an international resource. The world is entitled to these creatures as well. And they did so using science. They didn't believe in just doing it on principle. You get that a lot today with environmentalists who are doing things on principle, regardless of what the science says. They didn't do that. They said we need to manage this life on the basis of what science says. If science says that this population is overpopulated for this region, then we do need to thin the herd. We can't just say it's wrong to kill them, period. You have to look at it and say, is it sustainable? Because obviously, land is used for commercial purposes and agriculture and things like that. And the land that's set aside, can it support the population as it is? You don't want a species to get too large in terms of numbers because if the land can only hold 10,000 specimens and you've got 12,000, you're endangering all 12,000 of them because there's simply not enough available land and food for them. So for that reason, they did favor open access to hunting.
One of the complicated parts of Roosevelt is his opinions toward indigenous peoples and the impact that his conservation policies had on native lands and treaties with native tribes. It did take away a lot of land from native tribes.
Well, that goes into his view of the wildlife and the land as an international and a national thing, and not. You can look at something and say it's private ownership, but you can also say tribal ownership. He viewed it pretty much the same way, which is that this is not the property of any group of people or any person in particular. It is the property of everybody. And so, yes, he kind of does step on the rights of indigenous peoples in that respect, but at the same time, that kind of goes with the philosophy of an international perspective on resources, that they are the property of everybody, regardless of culture or individual.
He also had a low view of the tribes in Africa. He called them in his book on Africa savages.
Well, that wasn't just Roosevelt. I mean, that was pretty endemic to European and American society in general. Yeah. As president, he you may recall when he took the Panama Canal, and I say the word "took" because he took the canal. Those are his own words. He mentioned the fact that while Congress debated, I just took it. He viewed it as benefiting the whole, that all of the world would benefit from the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and so he did it. He didn't care that the Colombians didn't want it done. He just said, "We're going to do it,"
Yeah, he
because
considered it one of his two major achievements, and that and the Reclamation Act were his the two things that he thought were his biggest achievements as president.
well, as president, he was big in conservation. He established 3 national parks and also 2 national monuments that later became national parks. He established Crater Lake in 1902, Wind Cave in South Dakota in 1903, and Mesa Verde in Colorado in 1906. In 1906, he also passed the Antiquities Act, which allowed for the presidential creation of national monuments, which is done even to this day. He created 18 of them, which was actually the most any president created until Barack Obama created 26. The first was Devil's Tower in 1906, and then the second was Petrified Forest, also in 1906, which later became a national park in 1962, and then the Grand Canyon, which he designated a national monument in 1906, and it later became a national park in 1919. So, I mean, he had a greater impact in terms of environmentalism than any president before, and in many ways since. I mean, if you look at other presidents that follow later, they're building on what he established. And so you can say, like, yeah, there's more parks now than there were then. Well, of course, there's more now than there were then. There were none back in his time. He created them.
I think the conversation just now between Roosevelt and Indy kind of encapsulates his feelings toward conservation, and it kind of gets to kind of there's both his interest in conservation and also his interest in preserving the memory of the natural world, even as towns and cities and ranches develop on the land. And so a lot of his collections, his work to collect for museums of natural science, a lot of his work is to try to preserve that memory. So it seems like there would be a contradiction between his conservation efforts and his um, shooting and collecting a wide variety of species. But in reality, the for him, the two kind of went hand in hand. That he wanted to preserve the memory of what he saw as um, uh, species um, that were endangered. So. And
Now, here we have.
also expanding knowledge of all the species in the world. He really um,
He wanted
and we can
he
kind of
wanted
go
to
back even
democratize
to
access.
uh, Jefferson commissioning the expedition to the west with
The Louisiana Purchase.
hmm,
The Louisiana Purchase of 1803.
yeah. So
Yeah. What Roosevelt wants to do is he wants to democratize nature,
Yeah.
make it the people's land, make it the people's resource, make it accessible to everybody. That's the idea. But you put the specimens in the museum because not everybody can get to Africa to ever see them, and therefore here they can see them and see the diversity of life and hopefully gain appreciation for it.
And there were two
Because it's
different types of collections. There was the public collection that you would see if you were visiting the museum. There was also the collection that was used by the scientists working at the museum to study and uh, catalog and study all the various species that were collected. And
oh
so,
yeah, I've been. If you've ever been to like the Field Museum, if you ever get a chance to go on the behind the scenes tours of the museum, the collections are huge. I mean, you go into a room that is about half the size of a football field, filled with nothing but just drawer after drawer of specimens. They can open a drawer and there's hundreds of beetles. Open another drawer, hundreds more, different birds, everything all preserved, just chronicling the rich diversity of life that there is, and it aids in research and understanding these things. Yeah, specimens collections as I said, I've been to the Field Museum. It's just massive. It's all above the top floor of the Field Museum, which you can't actually visit normally. Is offices and laboratories and huge collections. There's also below ground because there's sublevels of the museum, and they have huge collections down there of specimens and artifacts, and it's just amazing to see the vast, diverse range of specimens that they have. Now we saw there Frederick Selous a second ago, and I just wanted to touch on Frederick Selous as who he is because we won't go into too much about him because he does reappear a few episodes from now. Actually, I guess about 6 or 8 episodes from now. Frederick Selous was, as in his early years, he actually took a fascination with nature as well. He used to gather insects and bird eggs, and he was fascinated with African exploration and big game hunting. And so at age 19, he traveled to Zimbabwe and South Africa and basically became a hunter, a big game hunter. From 1872 until 1890, he explored and hunted the Transvaal in the southern Congo and collected specimens for museums as well. In all, over 5,000 specimens, which he collected for the the Natural History Museum in London, and thousands of plants, thousands of insects. I believe it was 500. I wrote this down. 524 mammals, including lions, rhinos, elephants, and antelope. The thing that he did different than what we just talked about Roosevelt is that he gained the respect and trust of the local tribes. And he was also considered an expert with firearms. Even though he claimed he wasn't, he was a sharpshooter. He definitely was. In 1890, he began working with the British South Africa Company, and he guided expeditions through South Africa so they could create roads. In 1891, he noted that big game hunting was decimating the animal populations and became more committed to conservation. He met Theodore Roosevelt at the Boone and Crockett Club in 1902, and he helped. I believe you mentioned this to me that he helped organize the transportation for the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition we're seeing here. They met actually on the steamer. The steamer was called the Hamburg. After this expedition, he actually founded the Shikar Club, which was a sporting club, rugby, from what I understand, which also encouraged conservation. He's most famous for his military exploits, which we really won't go into here too much, other than to say at this point he'd already fought in the Matabele War in 1893 between the British South African Company and the Kingdom of Lobengula, which is in modern Zimbabwe. So despite the fact that he had actually gained a lot of the trust of the natives, he did actually still kind of side with the more of imperialist attitude. Now, I want to go back a little bit and talk about the expedition because there's a lot to this expedition.
They went through Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan throughout the expedition and took advantage of the British train infrastructure that was built pretty recently in the last. I forget when they built the rail infrastructure, but they took advantage of it.
Well, the expedition actually started in New York City in 1909. They departed on the steamship Hamburg, and Frederick Selous was on board. And so he decided, along the trip to Africa, he decided to join the expedition. He helped them organize it, but he didn't. He wasn't originally part of the expedition. They transferred to the German ship Admiral, which the German ship allowed them to carry ammunition because they were going to need a lot of ammunition for this expedition.
A lot of ammunition and a lot of salt, actually.
Yeah.
Salt for the
Yeah.
taxidermy.
Exactly. They began their expedition in Mombasa in British East Africa, which is modern day Kenya. And like you said, they went to the Belgian Congo, which is today, what's it called today? The Democratic Republic of Congo. It's gone through several names: Belgian Congo, Zaire, and now the DRC. They followed the Nile north until they got to Khartoum in Sudan, which is where the expedition ended. It was financed by Theodore Roosevelt himself and by Andrew Carnegie, the famous philanthropist. Their goal was specimens for the Smithsonian, as well as the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. The
Those
expedition's
are the two
leader.
places he sold his, or he gave away his childhood collection of taxidermied birds and animals when he initially gave up conservation. When he left Harvard and
And ventured into politics. Yeah.
he left Harvard it after his father died, and he was not as interested in the becoming a scientist in the way that Harvard had redeveloped its curriculum that was based more around microscopes and lab work that one might be doing in a museum. He was more interested in being a naturalist in a more traditional sense that in this kind of way that he would be going out collecting and describing and tagging specimens that he collected. So I think and he happened to meet his first wife Alice at Harvard. They got married, and he ended up going to law school. And it wasn't until after Alice died that he did some traveling outdoors and regained his passion for that work. So anyway, that's kind of a that's a little aside, but
Its total specimens for the expedition actually totaled 23,151 specimens. The large animal specimens consist of 11,397 different creatures, including 4,897 mammals, something like 4,000 birds, 2,000 reptiles, amphibians, 500 different fish, as well as over 11,000 small specimens, insects, crabs, plants, little things like that. Now, Burton's oryx here that they're talking about is its a real thing, and I looked it up because I was just curious. It's called scientific name is Oryx calatus. It was first identified by Oldfield Thomas in 1892, but it was reassessed as the fringe-eared oryx, which is a subspecies of the East African oryx. 1912, Richard Lydecker basically said that Burton's oryx is not a species of its own.
The oriole would have been one of the birds he would have heard as a youth. He was particularly captivated by birds as a youth, listening to their song and observing them and taxiderming them. He was particularly interested in the meadowlark. He wouldn't just describe the qualities of the animal, he would describe their behavior in his writings.
Roosevelt, you mean? Yeah.
Roosevelt would. Yeah. Right.
Burton's oryx, or the fringe-eared oryx, still exists. It's considered a vulnerable or threatened species. I think it's classified as vulnerable, not really not threatened as in nearing endangered, but it is vulnerable. The populations are still in risk. So it's not something fictional for this episode or anything like that. It's an actual creature. It should be noted that this expedition actually did more than just collect big game. It served as a bit of international diplomacy. After the expedition, they attended the funeral of King Edward VII of England. And then Roosevelt headed to Norway and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, which he received for his role in ending the Russo-Japanese War. They returned to the United States in June of 1910, and he wrote the African Game Trails, the book African Game Trails, detailing the expedition, which I believe you've read, or at least I think that's what you said you read.
Yeah, I've read significant portions of it. He goes into a lot of a lot of descriptions of the behavior of the. He's especially interested in describing the large game animals. He's especially captivated by lions in his book, and he goes into great detail on the behaviors of the animals, the descriptions of the animals, and also what it took to collect the animals. He provides a lot of detail into uh, who shot how many bullets to take down the various animals, and a lot of times it was a group effort, as he describes it.
Well, it's mentioned earlier in the episode here about the rhino, the charging
Yeah.
rhino,
Yep.
and I marked that in the book. I marked it the part in which he actually does talk about that, and I'm just gonna read that right here.
Sure.
I do have it. Slatter and I immediately rode in the direction given, following our wild-looking guide, the other gun bearers trotting after us. In 5 minutes we'd reached the opposite hill crest where the watcher stood, and he at once pointed out the rhino. The huge beast was standing in an entirely open country, although there were a few scattered trees of no great size at some little distance from him. We left our horses in a dip in the ground and began the approach. I cannot say that we stalked him, for the approach was too easy. The wind blew from him to us, and a rhino's eyesight is dull. 30 yards from where he stood was a bush 4 or 5 feet high, and through the leaves it shielded us from the vision of his small pig-like eyes as we advanced toward it, stooping in single file, I leading. The beast stood with an uncouth statue. This should be stature. I think it's a misprint in this. His hide black in the sunlight. He seemed that he was, as he was, a monster surviving from the world's past, from the days when beasts of the prime ran riot in their strength, before man grew so cunning of brain and hand as to master them. So little did he dream of our presence that when we were within 100 yards, he actually lay down. Walking lightly, with every sense keyed up, we at last reached the bush, and I pushed forward the safety of the double-barreled Holland rifle, which I was now for use in the first time in a big game animal. As I stepped to one side of the bush, so as to get a clear aim, with Slider following, the rhino saw me and jumped to his feet with the agility of a solo pony. As he rose, I put in the right barrel, the bullet going through both lungs. At the same moment he wheeled, blood spouting from his nostrils, and galloped full on. Before he could get quite all the way around his headlong reach to us, I struck him with my left-hand barrel, and the bullet entering between the neck and shoulder and piercing his heart. At the same time, Captain Slider fired, his bullet entering the neck vertebrae, plowing through the ground with the horn and feet. The great bull rhino, still headed towards us, dropped just 13 paces from where we stood. This was a wicked charge, for the rhino meant mischief and came on with the utmost determination. And he was photographed with the rhino, like he photographed many specimens. It's a big rhino. I know you and I have been to the Field Museum many a time, so we've seen a lot of the specimens they have there. It's a beautiful collection. I've actually been up in the off limits section where the various naturalists and scientists work, and I've seen the collections themselves, and it's pretty impressive. It should be noted that we talked about the sheer number of specimens that they took on this expedition. That while they shot something like 500 big game animals, they also did butcher and eat 262 of them. So some of it was for food for the expedition itself.
Right.
So it wasn't just shooting lots of specimens for museums. Part of it was also sustaining the large group they had with them. All right, this is the end of the first of the 2 episodes, and now we're heading to the second episode, which was originally set in 1908, but obviously, as they're paired here, it would have to be 1909 now. Now here you can see this period in the episode, in between the 2 episodes, was filmed later because Corey Carrier, who plays young Indy, looks a lot older. That's because he is a lot older. He's about 5 or 6 years older than he was. They're just lucky he didn't have a huge growth spurt and suddenly be like 6 feet tall. They'd have to have him on his knees like Mel Brooks in Spaceballs or something. And now we're heading to Paris. Truly beautiful city. Of course, they're not there yet, but I forgot there's this whole section. This is as long as it is.
From a story perspective on the show, not really historically based, what do you think was the backstory for Indy's family ending up on the Roosevelt expedition?
What was the backstory?
Yeah.
Um, I think it was simply another opportunity Lucas wanted. I mean, you mean in terms of production as opposed to narrative?
I was thinking of narrative. It seemed kind
Oh,
of
in terms of narrative?
it did seem kind of anachronistic to the
The narrative, well, the narrative was mentioned. It was his friend, Henry Jones Sr.'s friend from college.
yeah.
The scene was cut, but Mendlicott, the guy that we saw at the beginning, there was supposed to be a scene where we established their old college buddies and that they had that same routine that Henry had with Marcus Brody in Last
Yeah.
Crusade.
Yeah, it just seemed
And so that's how the tie-in
it
was, that
seemed
he knew.
pretty loose, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So here we have Paris, the beautiful city. This part here was again all filmed later, just to tie the episodes together. There we had the Pont Alexander III bridge and the Grand Palais behind it. There's the Fontaine de Mer, Notre Dame Cathedral. Truly a beautiful city. Now they're going to the Louvre. The Louvre itself was there's the Eiffel Tower. They're kind of doing a roundabout because they're going all over the place. They were further east. They're back to the Eiffel Tower now, so they're taking a roundabout tour through the city. Because you've got the Pont Alexander, the third bridge. That's west of the Louvre, east of the Eiffel Tower. Then we saw Notre Dame, which is far to the east of all of that, and then suddenly at the Eiffel Tower. So either they were out for a really long buggy ride, or the driver was drunk and just couldn't keep a straight course.
Well, they're in Paris because you saw those things. So
Oh yeah, it's just established shots, not necessarily done in the order in which you'd probably encounter them if you were riding through the city.
yeah.
But now I'm getting hungry. Okay, this is supposed to be taking place at the Louvre. The Louvre itself is considered a palace, but it was originally built in the late 12th century as a castle. The rebuilding of it as a palace began in the 17th century in 1624 by Louis Louis the 13th, and then Louis the 14th in what year was it? 1659. It opened a museum in 1789. Sorry, 1798, as to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of toppling the monarchy. There's the Mona Lisa we just saw. The Mona Lisa is, obviously considered the most famous painting in the world. Leonardo da Vinci painted it between 1503 and 1506. Despite what people think, it's not actually on canvas; it's on poplar wood. It's an oil painting on poplar. The model was Lisa Gherardini, who was the wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a silk merchant in Florence. He never delivered the painting. He said it was never finished, and he traveled with it. He may have, in fact, continued to work on it as late as 1517. There we have another painting. That painting is The Old Man and His Grandson by, what's his name? She mentioned Ghirlandaio. Domenico Ghirlandaio. And here we're going to see Edgar Degas. You can already see it. L'Absinthe. This painting is interesting because this is not in the Louvre. They're supposed to be at the Louvre, but that's actually in the Musée d'Orsay. It was. I don't think it was ever displayed in the Louvre. Irony of this, a painting of a man and a woman sitting there drinking, is that it was considered obscene and degenerate because she's a woman drinking in public. So critics described it as a painting of a whore, even though it's just a woman. There's no context for anything obscene in it. Oh, puppet shows. Those puppet shows in Paris, I just wanted to point something out. They refer to them, of course, as marionettes, not puppets. But the most famous was created in 1808. It's called Genial. Now, that's Norman Rockwell. We should probably talk a little bit about Norman Rockwell. I'm not sure how familiar you are with him.
I don't have a lot of.
Well, this takes place in 1908. And in 1908 or 1909, depending upon how you want to look at it. Originally filmed 1908, later reorganized into 1909. Norman Rockwell at this time would be 14 years old. And simply put, he was not in Paris. This is inaccurate. Norman Rockwell would not have been in Paris at this time. At age 14, he entered the Chase Art School, which is today known as the New York School of Art. And then he went to the National Academy of Design in 1910. So he was in New York City at the time of this. Now his famous ancestor he's referring to is Alonzo David Rockwell. He did not invent the electric chair. Let's make that clear. He was an electrotherapist at a New York Women's Hospital, and where he used shock treatment therapy on everything from epilepsy to cancer. The electric chair itself was commissioned by the Gerry Commission, and if the name Gerry sounds familiar to you, it's Eldridge Gerry, for whom the term gerrymandering came about. The Jerry Commission was established by the New York governor because he wanted a different way to execute people. And they sought information on how they could employ the death penalty more humanely and effectively. And so he created a three-member panel chaired by Elbridge Gerry, sorry. And in 1888, they recommended electrocution. Bill was passed and it went into effect, and so they began developing the electric chair. The interesting thing about the electric chair is that it was actually part of the conflict between Nikola Tesla and what's his name? Oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. Thomas Edison. They wanted to. Edison recommended the electric chair use alternating current, and the reason he did that, well, actually, he had somebody else credited as the most effective, because he wanted to say that alternating current was more dangerous. Not because it was actually more effective, it was a way of scaring people, because Edison wanted to see the use of direct current. Now, ultimately, alternating current wins out, but the idea for using electricity to kill somebody came about in many ways as a result of Thomas Edison trying to scare people on the dangers of alternating current. Now, Rockwell was part of the New York Medico-Legal Commission, which tested electrocution methods. And what he was in charge of, or was part of, is determining where to put the electrodes on a human body in order to kill somebody. So he didn't invent the chair. He just helped design the pattern for placing of electrodes. Just as a side note on that. Rockwell is mentioned there just a second ago that he said that his parents wouldn't approve. His mother was Episcopalian. His father was Presbyterian, although he converted to Episcopalian later. They were a little, old-fashioned, and so they wouldn't have approved of this place. This place is real. It is the Lapine Gilles. It was built at least by the year 1860. Originally it was called something else, but it became known after a while as the Cabaret des Assassins. In 1875, Andre Gill, who ran the establishment, had a canvas sign. There was a canvas sign painted for it. He ran it or he painted it. He may have actually been the person who painted the sign. And it was of a rabbit wearing a hat and like sleeping out of a saucepan. And the place started to get the nickname of Gill's Rabbit. So it became known as Lapine à Gilles. And then it turned into Lapine à Gilles, which basically means the agile rabbit, or the fast rabbit, or the nimble rabbit. So that was actually its nickname, although it's known as that now. Picasso actually painted his A Lapine à Gilles in 1905. Now here we have some figures. There's 4 figures here that have just been introduced. We have Edgar Degas, Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and then Fernande Olivier, who would be the woman. Olivier was she met Picasso in Paris in 1904, and they were in a relationship from 1904 until 1911 when he kind of dumped her, I guess. Here we have Pablo Picasso. We will see Picasso again in this series. He makes an appearance in a later episode as well. Now, they're talking about Edgar Degas. Degas is kind of weird. He was, in the 19th century, had a revolution in art where you had a lot of the new modern art rising, very revolutionary takes on art and how it was done. They came to be known as expressionists. I'm sorry, as impressionists. I'm sorry, impressionists. Degas didn't like that term. He preferred realist. But now here we see a painting. He's painting very similar to a kind of painting that Degas did, which was he liked to paint women bathing. Now this painting looks a lot like a painting called The Tub, and that was painted in 1886 by Edgar Degas. So what Picasso here is replicating The Tub. Now there we have Georges Braque. Braque and Picasso were friends. They both basically invented Cubism. In fact, Braque himself is actually the person to whom it was coined. He painted landscapes, and in 1908, a landscape of his, I believe it was Matisse, the artist Matisse, who said that he was painting little cubes, that the landscape looked like little cubes, and the term Cubism was coined as a result. Braque and Picasso were really good friends, but they're also kind of rivals in a sense. They were always trying to be more innovative than the other. Braque really gets the short end of the stick when it comes to talking about Cubism. Everybody always talks about Picasso, but they both saw themselves as innovators, and they both were innovative. Interesting, and they also tied it in with airplanes, kind of because the new technologies and that were emerging. They viewed their paintings as the artistic version of that. So much so they actually called themselves Wilbur and Orville, after the Wright brothers. It was like little nicknames they had for each other, was Wilbur and Orville. Now this painting we're about to see here is the La Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is was painted in 1907, so it would have been painted a year before this episode takes place. It depicts 5 brothel prostitutes from Barcelona, and Picasso actually referred to the painting as "Mon Bordel," my brothel. It's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. That sketch actually looks a lot like The Three Women, which Picasso painted in 1908. Just to give you a little more on Degas, and he was very influential, despite not really associating with the other Impressionists. I mean, he associated with them, but unlike them, who were they were a little more libertine in their, he was very conservative, which is kind of ironic that he would be so revolutionary in terms of his art style, yet at the same time so reserved in terms of his personality. Unlike the other Impressionists, he painted indoors. They Impressionists tended to be paint outdoors, whereas he preferred to paint inside, even if it was depicting something outside. Which is why he said he paints from memory, because he doesn't actually paint from the subject matter in front of him. He painted from what he remembered, which is also kind of impressive when you consider that he had vision problems. Um, Now, I mentioned flight, and I mentioned that because of this scene. Uh, there we go. There's the explanation. Uh, like I said, they often times referred to themselves as Wilbur and Orville
Hmm.
because it's part of the the whole early 20th century. The modern art movement that we're seeing with Cubism and the like. It's part of a very rapidly transitioning society with the airplane, the automobile. Um,
Telephone.
yeah, telephone was a little earlier, but still
Yeah.
there. Yeah,
Cars
telephone.
are on the brink of.
Well, cars have been around for a while. But yeah, I mean, it's the airplane is really the defining
Yeah.
feature of modernity because it the thing with the airplane is that it not only was technology that fulfilled man's desire to fly, but it offered a new perspective on the world. Because when you're up in an airplane, you look out a window of the airplane, the world looks so different from down on the ground. It looks like it's a miniature, and and it's a completely different perspective on the world. And in many ways, that's what the art was reflecting of this period, is a different perspective on the world. It was both It was both extending from the notion of change and bringing about the change. Um, there's a term for called futurism, which refers to the idea that art and literature is a reflection of the changing nature of society. And you get futurist poems which try to simulate the sound of an automobile, or art which tries to capture a different perspective on the world. Cubism. You can look at a cubist painting and say, why are there two women's eyes on the same side of their head? And of course, people have two eyes. You don't see two eyes when you're looking at them from the side, but you know they have them. Whereas if you just take a step to the side, you can now see the person and see the other eye on their head. You can't do that with a painting. You step to the side of a painting and all you see is the same painting because it's a flat perspective, two dimensions, and not really reflective of reality. So in many ways, their painting and their style of art is meant to both reveal the limitations of the medium and also expand the depth of the medium by giving it a perspective that is different from traditional static two-dimensionality. Just as the Impressionists before them, by capturing the essence of a painting as opposed to the minute details as they are, with fine brushstrokes. Instead, you just give the general feeling of what you're looking at. Art was changing. Now, I forgot to point this out that we talked about the painting that Picasso painted, La Demoiselle d'Avignon. Fernande Olivier was actually one of the models in that painting. She was actually a subject for something like 60 different paintings. Now, like I said, Picasso and Braque were both influential. Braque, in some ways, was more influential. The difference is that he didn't promote himself nearly as well. Yeah, at this stage in painting, Braque and Picasso were in their analytical cubism phase, which is very very representative of what we're seeing in terms of the painting they were talking about. I
What's
still don't know
the
why they chose to.
influence on Norman Rockwell?
I'm not sure because I'll be honest with you, Norman Rockwell shouldn't have been there. I mean, like I said, he was supposed to. He was in New York at the time. Curious about Rockwell is that he never saw himself as an artist through his work. His most famous work is, of course, with the Saturday Evening Post, where he painted covers for that. He was never very happy with that because he felt that that was illustration, not art. And I mean, he downplayed his ability to capture reality. And I think in many ways, it's he's the antithesis in some ways of the modern artist. He painted for the Saturday Evening Post, a very conservative publication, and his paintings for his covers were always depictions of American society in the familiar. When you looked at a Norman Rockwell painting, you saw a narrative expressed in a single portrait that reaffirmed nostalgia and reaffirmed values, what we're seeing as shared American values. So much, of course, that when after FDR gave his speech about the four great freedoms, he painted his famous Four Freedoms series, which is freedom from want, freedom from freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so whereas Cubists, looked at the world and tried to view it differently, Rockwell painted the familiar in a sense that everybody could relate to it. So in many ways, he's the antithesis of the Cubist movement. Although he was never really, I don't think he was ever really fully satisfied with that. He never, like I said, he never viewed himself as a painter. He felt like his work was somehow, in some ways, inferior, which is kind of unusual because, as an artist, he was able to convey a thought, an idea, and a feeling very effectively. I mean, when you look at a Norman Rockwell painting, you see the little story there. The cop and the little kid sitting at the bar of a not a restaurant or an ice cream joint or something like that, and you see the little kid's got a little bag like he was running away from home or something. There's a story there, and you can kind of put together the pieces. Whereas when you look at like a Picasso, the pieces are shattered and they're not telling a story so much as they're an emotion. His famous Guernica, which is about the Spanish Civil War, it evokes feelings of chaos and of violence and the anarchy of the whole thing. So it tells a narrative, but it tells an emotional narrative of feeling more because it's not literal. Whereas with Rockwell, you've got a very, very clear iconography about his painting where everything you understand, at least from an American perspective, you understand how this fits into American society. Simpler times, simpler ideas, a morality. Um, now, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Rockwell is. I think he's appreciated in the United States. I'm not sure how well he's appreciated worldwide. Um, Sometimes I think he's derided a little bit because of his, I don't want to say Pollyanna depictions, but in many ways his very Pollyannish depictions of American society. But that was the point. The Saturday Evening Post, they didn't want edgy, they wanted familiar. Hmm.
Oh dear.
Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo. I have to admit, I have never finished Les Miserables. I'm not a fan of Hugo's writing. I'm not going to say he's not a great writer. He is. I just never much cared for it. Um, I don't know.
I
Maybe
don't
I
get
did
the
finish
sense
it.
that young Indy is a big fan of reading. So
I don't know. I may have finished it. I'm trying to remember if I finished it or not. I remember I wasn't a fan of his style so much that I did not read Hunchback of Notre Dame afterwards. I was going to, but I decided against it. Even though that was what I was looking forward to more, just because the idea of the story I thought appealed to me more. I do love Les Mis, the Broadway musical, or the um, it's great music, but it is not the book. But yeah, going back to what you asked about Rockwell, they don't talk enough about Rockwell in this episode. And like I said, I'm not sure why they even introduced him because he wouldn't have been in Paris in 1908 or 1909 for that matter. Um, and we never see him again in the series. We do see Picasso again in an episode set in Barcelona. No, yeah, is it Barcelona or is it Lisbon? No, it's Barcelona. Now you notice here that they've done they've done the matte painting in a very unrealistic style, sort of to be more evocative of a painting and not as a matte painting. Just a little artistic touch with the colors and the textures, which I kind of find interesting that they did that. This series was as far as visual effects were concerned, you don't notice the visual effects, but they're in a lot of this to recreate, early 20th century Europe. The technology that was developed for this television series was used by George Lucas later, obviously. He laid the groundwork for his Star Wars movies, his prequels. The technology that would be used in later episodes to depict large armies was used by the by Industrial Light and Magic for like Titanic to create the little virtual people on the Titanic in the movie of that name. Picasso, Chitam, Fernande. Picasso loves Fernande. Now this is meant to depict an actual event, and I'll get to that in a moment as to what the event is. We see Picasso here in costume. And now they're introduced two Americans, actually an American, I should say. Okay, the guy there is supposed to be Daniel Henry Conviler. Now, the actor they've got playing him is not doing a German accent. I'm pretty sure he had a German accent because he was born in Germany even though he lived in France. And there we see Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. That would be her partner. Stein ran a Paris salon called the 27 Rue de Fleurs. It opened in 1903, and the walls of her salon were decorated with art. She was a big collector of Picasso's works, big advocate of his stuff. Her brother was fond of other painters, but now here we have Rousseau. That's Henri Rousseau, who was an Impressionist painter. He was discovered by Picasso. He was pretty fairly unknown. Picasso found at a market, he found a painting of Rousseau's where it was being sold for the canvas, so people could paint over it. And now this is supposed to depict an event. In 1908, there's something called the La Banquette Rousseau, which was a celebration of Rousseau himself, and Picasso held it. And so that's what this is depicting, is the La Banquette Rousseau. I mentioned earlier Conviler. He was an art collector who was a supporter of the Cubist movement, and he was also a publisher, and he published Gertrude Stein's works. And so he gave a lot of opportunity to artists and to writers, such as Stein, who, of course, was a writer. She was also an artist as well. But so this is meant to depict the La Banquette Rousseau, which was a big a big party. It was referred to as being, like out of control, although clearly it wasn't an out of control party. That's just kind of the attitude people have towards. I like that line. Shoot her. Now, of course, this episode was originally intended to be set in 1908. That's the Le Banquet or so was in 1908. It kind of falls into error if we put this after the expedition in Africa, because that's clearly 1909. So this episode was originally supposed to be set in September of 1908, which of course would correspond with the events and characters. But if it follows after the expedition, which is in September of 1909, this has to be taking place later. So it's a little bit of an incongruity that pops up in this re-edit of the episodes. The Lapine Gilles is actually still around. Sadly, I didn't visit it when I was in Paris. Meant to, but I forgot completely. Now, Degas was in fact had vision problems for a long time, but he began to lose his sight around 1890 or so. So he was virtually blind, and they do depict that here
Hmm.
as he's right here trying to feel for the brush and he can't quite find it. I guess that's the other reason that Rockwell's in this episode is for this little bit here, so that he could sketch something and be mistaken as Picasso's. Now we're back to another segment here that was filmed later, 5, 6 years later. Now, interesting note: if you look at that scene, Margaret Tyzak as Miss Seymour takes a drink and coughs at just the moment where almost like spit take. That was the same scene that we just saw, filmed from a different camera angle. Well, that's chapter 2 of Young Indiana Jones, Passion for Life. I have to admit, as a historian, we have to learn a lot about a variety of subjects, including, art. Art comes up, and I had to do a little more research on this just because I wanted to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And
Yeah, I'm
as an ancient
not
historian,
very familiar with art or art histories.
well, I know more about about art from ancient art because obviously it ties in more with my field. But
Sure.
I've had classes on futurism, which mentioned futurism. We had to do research on it, and so I'm not completely unfamiliar with it, but it is important in terms of understanding the transition of American society and world society at the turn of the century and the early years. All right, well that does it for our commentary track, and thank you, Anthony, for participating in this.
Yeah, it's been great.
And I hope everybody who listened to it found it useful and maybe picked up a thing or two that they didn't know, and have hopefully it encourages them maybe even to try to learn more. That was George Lucas's whole purpose with this series was to try to inspire people to learn a little more about history, and I hope it actually is the case that people do, and if in any way our commentary track can help them, well, that's I think that's a good goal and a good result. So thank you for appearing here today with this commentary track, and thank you to all those who are listening to it. Hope you enjoyed it, and until the next time, take care.